Hello everybody and welcome to another watercolor tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you notice that the length of this video is quite a bit longer than my usual videos, that is because I have decided to try something different this week and do a real-time tutorial of something that usually would have been a very sped up Sketchbook Sunday episode. So I hope you decide to stick around and that you enjoy the process. The painting itself is inspired by Ellen Crimi. I will link her in the description box, so credit goes to her for the inspiration behind this painting, as well as the inspiration behind doing a real-time tutorial, because I really enjoyed using her tutorial. It was really fun to paint along at the same time that she was painting without having to pause the video and rewatch it. So let me know if you enjoy this video. Anyways, the first thing that we did, or that I did, is I just taped the borders of my piece of paper just because I, as always, want a nice and clean and crisp look. And then I took my flat brush, so I'm just applying water in a really nice even layer to the top 2/3 of my piece of paper, landscape-wise. And you might have to do this a couple of times depending on your paper. The paper in my sketchbook is quite good, but it's not as good as 100% cotton paper, which is kind of like a luxury. I almost never use my cotton paper because it's just, well, one, it's quite expensive, but second of all, I really don't want to go through it at a quick rate for that reason. So it really is a joy to paint on though, and if you're ever doing paintings like this that require a lot of blending and natural bleeding of the watercolor paint, then I do recommend using cotton paper. But anyways, so what we're doing here is we are applying hues of blue and green to the bottom portion of that 2/3 that we painted with a layer of water. And then we're tilting our piece of paper downwards and allowing that pigment to bleed in a downward motion. So you can see me here tilting my sketchbook upside down because that's exactly what I want it to be doing. I want it to be bleeding downwards. And if your piece of paper dries at a quicker rate, you can help the paint bleed along by using just a small, cheap spritz bottle filled with water and just maybe spritzing once or twice to help that pigment bleed along downwards. So mine unfortunately does dry at a quicker rate, not as quick as some pieces of watercolor paper that I've used, but it does dry quite quickly, so I did have to help it along quite a bit through this process, but I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. You might find that your watercolor kind of pools at the very top, and this is because your water that you painted on as your first layer is pooling at the bottom. So naturally, when the pigment flows downwards, it will start to create this kind of horizontal pooling effect. So you can really easily clear that up by just taking a round brush that has been dipped in water, and then, well, the reason we're dipping it in water is to get that pigment off, and then we're just lifting off that extra pigment to create the shape that we want. Because we want, I mean, the reason why we're allowing this pigment to bleed downwards is because we are trying to create the illusion of a background forest. So by allowing that water to bleed downwards, it naturally is supposed to create these spikes which kind of look like pine trees. So if you find that yours aren't doing that, you can help them along with the very tip of your brush, and then, you know, rinse your brush so it just has water on it, and then kind of help that tip along. You'll see what I mean in a moment, because one of my trees, it bleeds a little bit wonky, and so I end up fixing it. So here we go. one of my trees looked like the top was, I don't know, it had a broken branch. So I just lifted off that extra watercolor and helped that particular portion of paint look a little bit more triangular shaped, because I do want my my trees to look like pine trees and not these blobs. That being said, if yours do look like blobs, do not get discouraged, because this is just the background of your piece of paper. It's really not the shapes that we're going for. It's just the general combination of the colors and, creating this beautiful, very abstract image of a forest in the background, like a misty background forest. So don't worry if yours don't look exactly like mine, because who knows, maybe it'll end up looking even nicer. So when you're sort of happy with your kind of main background treed portion, you can go ahead and just start adding some highlights on the bottom third, because we want it to look like there's ice or snow on the bottom. I just took a very watered down blue mixed with a little bit of gray and just painted on some random shapes to make it look like there's ice or snow on that bottom third. Now, while your background is still wet, and by the way, during that entire process, your background should have been kept wet in order to keep that whole bleeding thing going. You kind of probably want to work fairly quickly so that you can achieve that look before your background dries. But anyways, I took some white acrylic paint here and I just flicked it onto my background while it was still wet. And this is because we want this to be a winter wonderland. And the reason why we're doing it while the background is still wet is because when acrylic paint hits wet watercolor, some kind of reaction occurs and the acrylic paint sort of blends into the water and creates this beautiful glowing halo effect. And keep in mind that when it dries, it looks a lot more blended in than when it was still wet. So I would say splat on about twice the amount of stars, or not stars, but snowflakes as you think look good. So if you think, you're done and you're like, okay, this looks good in terms of the amount of snowflakes, just keep going, probably for like put on double what you thought looks good, because it will dry in a way that makes the snowflakes less pronounced and less detailed. If you find that your snowflakes are almost not showing through at all, it's probably because your background wasn't dark enough to begin with. Earlier you saw me adding some blue in my sky, and that's because I wanted my background to be a little bit darker so that those white snowflakes would show through. So just keep that in mind before moving on to this step. Once all of that is dry and you're happy with your background and you're happy with the little bit of snow that you painted on the bottom third of your page, we are going to start adding the forefront details. And this is what makes the entire painting come together and look like this beautiful winter wonderland, because the viewer's eyes focus on the foreground details, which are going to be our trees. So I am going to be painting 3 trees, although 2 of them aren't going to be entirely in the frame. And so with my first one here, I'm just painting it in the middle, slightly to the right. And this is because we're working with the rule of thirds, and that's just naturally where our eyes fall. So it looks a lot nicer than if it was entirely in the middle of our painting. And as you saw me do earlier, I kind of mapped out where I wanted the branches of my pine tree to be before I filled it in by blending those branches together with honestly any color of green works here, but because we have some blue tones in our background, we can add some blue to our green watercolor to create this sort of aqua green, and it just looks so mystical and beautiful. but don't feel like you need to replicate these exact colors. The colors or the shades themselves don't matter very much. It's really application and how you combine the colors that you do have. So I mean, I can't even tell you what colors I'm using. I get asked in every single video what colors I'm using, but I threw out the name card when I first got my paints. So I only have 3 greens. I have sort of a lime green, kind of a muddy green, and then a bluish green. And from those 3 greens, I can make 15 more shades of green just by adding white, black, brown, yellow, combining the greens. So don't get too hung up on the exact colors. Just take what you think looks most similar to what you see me using. And who knows, it might end up looking much, much nicer than my painting. And I've had that experience many times when following other people's tutorials, because they do include the names of the paints that they're using, but I don't know what they are because I don't have my paint card, so I just guess and it ends up looking quite nice most of the time. Anyways, I extended my tree to reach all the way down, like past the frame of my painting, and this is just because my other 2 trees are going to be still in the foreground, like they're going to stretch over the horizon line, but I just thought it would be nice if it looked like one of the trees extends beyond the frame of the painting. And the way that I'm painting my pine trees is that I'm kind of creating the blobs of the branches first and then adding the flicks of detail afterwards. And I'm going to touch up this tree a couple more times anyways as we go through the painting, adding more details, then blurring them again. Because this isn't typically how I paint pine trees. I usually, use one of the 4 techniques that I mentioned in my most popular video on this channel, which is 4 techniques how to paint pine trees. And those are a lot more time effective than this one, because this is quite time consuming, I suppose. But I was following Ellen's tutorial, so I wanted to make it look as similar to hers as possible. By the way, all of the brushes that I use in this video are linked in my description, so if you do feel like adding them to your collection or you want to expand your collection of paintbrushes, feel free to do so. It's at no extra cost to you, but if you purchase the brushes using the links in my description, I do get some commission for it, so it just helps me as an artist. So I am now adding my other 2 trees. I'm starting with the one that's in kind of the right side of the painting. So most of the tree is not in the frame, and I really like how this looks. Honestly, this was probably my favorite of the 3 trees because it, the background, like what I'm painting on top of, was already this beautiful bluish green. So painting on top of it just accentuated those colors, and I really didn't have to paint as much detail as I did in that first tree because of those beautiful mix of colors in the first layer. So you're just sort of swishing and flicking here, flicking your branches out. We watched the first Harry Potter movie yesterday, which is why I have swish and flick in my mind. I ended up, I think, extending some of these branches in that second tree because it wasn't sticking out far enough. Like, it didn't look as realistic as I would like it to. There we go. So I'm just extending some branches, giving some more life to the tree, adding different shades of green, so darker undertones on top of the lighter portions just to create some contrast in the branches and the bristles of the tree. Make sure that when you're painting the second two trees on either side, like the left and the right side, that you do overlap onto the foreground a little bit past the horizon line, because this makes it look like the trees are closer to the viewer rather than being in the background with all of the blurred forest trees. So I'm doing the same thing as the right tree on my left side, and this is really easy. I didn't really put too much effort into this one because I used the beautiful dark background greens that were already there, so I just extended the tree that was already there basically by painting some branches and bristles in the foreground past the horizon line, so you can definitely do the same. I also really like how the snow that we painted earlier, or flicked on earlier, shows through some of the trees. I know that trees aren't technically supposed to be translucent, but I think it adds to that winter wonderland feel. Okay, so our foreground looks a little bit basic and white, so we're going to add some details here. I'm just using black and a little bit of brown to create these plant shrubs coming out of the ground, and then I'm adding rocks underneath them. My rocks are a little bit too brown, so I would recommend using gray or adding some watered down black to your brown so that they don't look like mounds of dirt in the snow. So I am going to fix that. I'm going to add a little bit of gray to my rocks to make them look a little bit more like rocks and a little bit more realistic. Basically, you're just painting like half moons or half circles, just the top half of a circle, I suppose. Now we're going to be adding the shadows that are coming from the other side of the rocks, as well as our trees, or basically just the rightmost tree, because that's the only one that has a shadow, has a room for a shadow in the direction that we're painting all of the shadows. At first I used sort of a grayish color, but I wasn't happy with how it looked. So I went in and I added some blue shading to the shadow to bring out the blue highlights in the background. I just wanted it all to come together, and I think the blue really added a very nice detail to the painting in general. Okay, so now comes the fun part. So I am using white acrylic paint, but you can use perhaps gouache or white watercolor paint from a tube. But honestly, if you have access to acrylic paint, I'm just using a cheap dollar store brand for the accents. That's really all you need. And you're just painting on some highlights onto the top portions of your branches. I noticed a little bit too late that the brush that I was using was way too thick, and the snow that I painted on looked like these washed out blobs, which is definitely not what snow looks like, especially not freshly fallen snow. So I would definitely use a thinner brush than I used to paint on these details, especially if you're using acrylic paint, because you can't really paint over acrylic paint with watercolor, because when acrylic paint dries, the surface is like the watercolor doesn't adhere to dried acrylic surface, so don't make the same mistake I did and use a thinner brush. in the end, it didn't really matter too much, and it won't matter too much if you apply your snow too thick as well, because we are going to be adding even more snow to kind of complete that winter wonderland look. So it's okay if your snow is very thick like mine is. I just tend to overanalyze my paintings, and when I'm looking at this right now, it just looks very blobby to me. Um, and yeah, that's like snow doesn't fall in blobs. It's supposed to be a little bit more evenly spread out, I suppose. But you can finish off your painting by flicking on some more white acrylic paint until you are happy with your winter wonderland look. You can add some other details if you want pops of color like birds or some more shrubs, but I'm pretty happy with how this looks. So I'm just going to peel the paint off or peel the tape off and call it a day. If you enjoyed this real-time tutorial, I would really appreciate if you let me know in the comments because that will encourage me to do more of these. It's a lot more effort because it's much longer, but I would be happy to do it if you guys enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next week.